Okay, I'm going to begin this webinar. Once again, I'd like to welcome all attendees to the first webinar in the mini e-course series on how to review IPCC assessment reports, webinars and guidance for climate experts, which is hosted by the Future Climate for Africa program. Today's webinar is entitled, How Does the IPCC Work? My name is Karen Maris, and I am a communications officer at South North in Cape Town, South Africa. And I'll be the moderator for this webinar. Our presenters today are Dr. Leo Meyer and Professor Jean Pascal van Iepersele. Our presenters today will conduct a series of presentations of about 25 minutes each, and I'll be keeping them to time very strictly. We will only be exchanging questions and answers after all the presentations have been made. Attendees are asked to submit their questions via the Q&A button, which should be located in the menu at the bottom of your screen. Please note that please indicate the particular panelist or presenter to whom you'd like to address your question. As the moderator, I will screen the questions and relay them verbally to the panelists. Our colleague Maria Jose of the CDKN program will be translating any questions to be received in Spanish into English for our presenters to respond to. We'll aim to answer as many questions as possible in the allotted time, and any questions that we can't address live, we will answer in writing following this event. The Q&A will be followed by a 2-minute poll in which we encourage everyone to participate. This webinar is being recorded and will be shared on the FCFA website. PDF copies of the English, French, and Spanish presentations will be available on the website later today. Registrants will be notified as soon as the recording is made available online. Please consider sharing these with anyone you may know and would like to view it but couldn't attend today. I'd now like to hand over to Dr. Leo Meyer, who will proceed with the next part of the presentations.
So, hello everybody. Just a brief check. If you now can see the first PowerPoint presentation with 3 people on the bottom. Is that visible? Just to check. Karen, can you confirm?
Yes, Leo, it is all good and we can see your presentation.
Okay, wonderful. Well, happy and honored to present to you this first part of our mini course, how the IPCC works. And together with Professor Jean Pascal van Iepersele, we will give a sort of a general introduction to all of you. Is my video also, can you see my face somewhere? Because I can't, but is it there?
Leo, you should receive a message just asking to...
Okay, there it is. Okay, now I should be visible.
Yes, you are.
Okay, thanks. So a general introduction on how the IPCC works, and we will show a couple of PowerPoints. These will be uploaded on the website, so don't bother to take too many notes. And we will, as said, also provide a French and a Spanish version, and there will be video recorded. Now, the goal of this course basically is to increase the participation of developing country experts in the development of the IPCC reports through its review mechanism. And we will explain all about reviews itself in the next webinar. Just a general word to start. The authority of the IPCC depends, among other things, on geographically balanced overviews and assessments of the world literature on climate change. And apart from the balanced composition of the author teams, it's equally important to have a balance in the reviews of the draft reports. In the past, these reports have been dominated by developed country experts, while climate change consequences, they hit developing countries the most. And especially the involvement of reviewers from the African and Latin American continent has been relatively low in the past, and we hope to increase that. Actually, last year we have conducted a course like this one to experts from the African continent, and that was quite successful. Now, we hope to encourage you and may even persuade you to bring your expertise into the review of the upcoming draft report of Working Group 2 on climate change impacts, adaptation, and vulnerability. That will be the focus of our course. Since it's a course, let's start with the learning objectives. After the course, you will understand the structure of the IPCC and its assessment process in general. You will be able to phrase effective review comments on the contents of facts and figures in IPCC draft reports based on your own expertise. That's important. And in addition, you can introduce additional knowledge to the IPCC from local and regional scientific literature that authors are not aware of. Well, what we tell here is based on our many years of experience within the IPCC, but it is our own responsibility. Therefore, we have this disclaimer that it is not the IPCC as an organization that produces this e-course. But you can trust us, it is thoroughly checked by the IPCC also itself. Now, briefly to the timeline of this course. As said, the focus will be on the review of the first of the draft of the Working Group 2 report. You can already register actually as an expert. That started at the 11th of October, and you can do that until the 6th of December, so there's time for that. Now we have the webinar 1, how does the IPCC work? Next week, same time, we will have webinar 2 actually going in depth on how to conduct an IPCC review with guidance and examples. And after that, we offer the possibility for those who are interested to register to what we call a one-to-one feedback on draft review comments. We can help you with phrasing the comments. They remain your responsibility, but especially how to make them effective. And we will tell more about this in the next webinar. Just last point in this, that the review of this Working Group 2 report will end at 13th of December, and any review comment has to be uploaded before that date. Now, you may be interested who are the participants, or at least the people that registered. First, Africa. You can see we have a lot of people from African countries. I think we have over 70 countries in total, and over 400 people that registered. A lot of people from Nigeria, Ethiopia, and other parts of the world. Latin America, we have 23 people from Peru, Colombia, 14 from Argentina, and scattered through Asia and Europe also a lot of people. So that is a good sign. Let me now focus on what the IPCC actually is. It is, first of all, it is an intergovernmental institution, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. It's organized, it's an organization of all UN governments, basically all countries in the world, and they request scientists to periodically report on the status of the knowledge of climate change. And the IPCC does that since 1990. It was installed 2 years before for the UN organizations. And since then, it organizes every 5 to 7 years scientific assessments of what is available, what we know about climate change impacts and response options in the literature. We had 5 assessments already, and now authors are working on the 6th assessment, and this is part of it. Apart from assessment reports, it also publishes special reports on specific themes, and all these reports are not just written by a few people, but huge teams of scientists from all continents. And their task is primarily to inform the policymakers of the UN member states, but also the general public, companies, NGOs, and private organizations. When we did this course last year, one person asked, why is the IPCC needed? You can find anything you want to know about climate change in literature. But the problem is there are thousands of scientific publications on climate change each year. And a policymaker of course, cannot read all of them, and they cannot base policies on just one single publication that they may have seen. So therefore, you need really an assessment of literature by a balanced team of authors to filter out what are the key messages that are relevant to policymakers. And as an example, the fifth assessment that was published, bulky reports in 2013, 2014, 830 authors, more than 1,000 contributors, and more than 2,000 reviewers producing over 140,000 comments. So it's a huge operation. This is a text taken from official language from IPCC to describe its formal mandate to assess. We will come back to that in the next part by Jean-Pascal, what assessing actually means. And most important is actually the second box where you can read IPCC reports should be neutral with respect to policy, although they may need to deal objectively with scientific, technical, and socio-economic factors relevant to the application of particular policy. That means IPCC should not be the advocate of a certain policy, but should just describe what options policymakers have. You can find them in the URL, which is at the bottom. Now, it's also important to know what IPCC is not. Just a second. It doesn't do research itself. It just evaluates what's out there in literature. Authors are not paid. They do this voluntarily and in their own time, or they're allowed to do that by their bosses. And the authors are not a member of the IPCC. Only governments are members. And as said, IPCC should be neutral regarding to policymakers. So it doesn't give any recommendation to policymakers or civil society what people should do, but it delivers the knowledge for taking informed decisions. The formal structure, as you can see, we have these 4 blocks. Working group 1 is basically the physics of climate change. Working group 2 is on impacts, adaptation, and vulnerability of climate change. Working group 3 on mitigation, which is basically all ways to reduce greenhouse gases. And there's a 4th group called the Task Force on National Greenhouse Gas Inventories, which deals with the science of emissions. And of course, there's a governance structure with a plenary of all representatives from governments. And there is a bureau, an executive committee, the secretariat, and they all help they make the structure for the authors, the contributors, and reviewers to produce the reports. A little bit more about the governance. All decisions by the IPCC are taken by the members, so basically by the governments. And the body of governments, 195 countries, they elect the chair, the vice chairs, the working group co-chairs. They determine what reports should be made and they decide about the scope and the outline. When a report is there, it is adopted by this plenary of representatives from governments. And they also have to approve the summary for policymakers. I'll come back to that. It's a very special thing. And all over that, there is very strict procedures how to produce reports. All the work is managed by 3 working groups and task forces, each for their own co-chairs, the secretariats, which are called technical support units, TSUs. Now, actually, the producers of the IPCC reports, there are 2 parts of it. First of all, producers that are nominated by governments and scientific institutions and are selected by the working group management. We have coordinating lead authors, CLAs, 2 or 4 per chapter. They coordinate the writing of a certain chapter. We have lead authors to a certain chapter, there can be 5 to 20, and they do the main writing. And we have what we call review editors. These are people that supervise whether the review comments that are there for the drafts are dealt with adequately. We'll come back to the review, of course, later. But there are also other contributors. Lead authors can ask specific specialists to contribute to a certain section. And each chapter now also has its own chapter scientist, which is basically a supporting person helping the coordinating lead authors to manage the whole chapter and to glue all the texts together. And we have the expert reviewers. Expert reviewers can be nominated, but it can be anyone with relevant expertise. That's a voluntary job. It's not paid. People can nominate themselves. The only thing they need to do is to declare that they have expertise. And these can be any individual. But there are also the governments themselves. They review the report as well. Not the first review, but of the second draft. What do they produce? Well, reports, big bricks of literature, all on the internet, luckily these days. The full assessment reports, each working group produces its own reports. And then there are these special reports, which are assessments on a very specific theme. And on top of that, there are also methodology reports. We won't go into detail on that. These are basically to set the science on how to report on inventories of greenhouse gases. And there is a group that supports the data and lots of expert meetings and workshops. So with that, I've given a brief introduction. I think I'm well in time and would like to hand over to Jean-Pascal. And I'll stop sharing my screen now. Jean-Pascal, you have the floor.
Join all of you. I hope you hear me as well. And that you can.
Hi, Jean-Pascal. Yes, we can hear you.
Can you see my presentation?
Not yet.
Oh, I have to click to one more button. Sorry. Can you see it now?
Yes, we can.
Okay, I have to move one window, close another one, and now I am ready. Bonjour à tout le monde. Je dis bonjour aux francophones parce que les questions en français seront les bienvenues aussi après. I was just saying in French that the questions in French were welcome afterwards as well. So what is a scientific assessment as the IPCC views it? Well, the first step in a scientific assessment made by the IPCC is the scoping of which topics will be addressed by a given report, whether it's an assessment report or a special thematic report. Then that scoping process, and in which many scientists and also stakeholders and representatives of governments participate, prepare a scoping document, a draft outline, which is then discussed at a plenary meeting of the IPCC by all governments of the world, the members of IPCC. And then when that outline has been modified to the taste of everyone, it is approved and agreed by the plenary, and this is on that basis that the report will be made. The report will be written on the basis of the scientific literature, mostly the peer-reviewed literature, and that literature needs to span a very wide spectrum of literature in order to really have an assessment of almost everything that's available. It's also written by a group of authors who have been selected on the basis of a number of criteria. The first criterion is scientific excellence and qualification, but also diversity is very important. Diversity from the geographical point of view, from the gender point of view, from the experience point of view in the IPCC, so that really the assessment is a collective product that take different views into account. When appropriate, and for example, when there is a certain amount of disagreement or fogginess around some of the findings, then uncertainty qualifiers like likely, very likely, extremely likely, or medium confidence, that kind of things are attached to the findings of the IPCC. I need to, okay. So the IPCC, I mean, is it a consensus machine? Is it prescriptive? These are often questions that are asked to the IPCC. In summary, the answer to that question is that the IPCC mandate says that it needs to be policy relevant. That means it needs to provide useful information for policymakers, but it cannot be policy prescriptive. I mean, it is not the task of the scientists to take the role of policymakers and to decide in their place what to do. So the job of IPCC is to assess the situation, to assess the processes at work, the main factors at work, but also to assess the elements of possible solutions, but to present them as options which are presented with their pluses and minuses, but without being prescriptive, because the choice needs to be made involving some value judgment, and that is to be done by the decision makers and the policy makers who have been elected for that reason, and not by the scientists of the IPCC. So the IPCC is doing really its best to deal as objectively as possible with the scientific literature on which it bases its assessment. So to produce a report is a long process, already explained, and it starts on the top left on the slide with the scoping process and the approval of the outline. Then after that, the IPCC Secretariat sends a general call to governments and organizations to nominate experts. To give you an idea, for AR5, the fifth assessment report, the IPCC Secretariat received 3,000 nominations, 3,000 vitas. As Leo explained, the bureaus selected 830 authors out of those 3,000. With those criteria I mentioned. Then the authors prepare a first draft of the text, and that first draft, which is based on the literature and following the guidelines given by the plenary approved outline, is then subjected to an expert review. This is the first round of review in a total number of cycles of review involving 3 reviews of one sort or another, and then that's where you can intervene, because as many experts as possible need to participate to that process to ensure a quality product. If there are many reviewers, there is a higher probability that the report will reflect the diversity of views, will reflect the full spectrum of literature, the full spectrum of the concerns in different parts of the world, because the concerns are not the same in Belgium, where I live, and in the Republic Democratic of Congo or Argentina. There are local context, local concerns, which is totally understandable. And all of those concerns need to be taken on board so that the report is really speaking to humanity, to the entire humanity, if I can summarize it that way. So it's very important to have as many reviews as possible, and to have as many reviewers' comments as possible. You know, in the fifth assessment report, a total of 140,000 review comments were collected overall, and each of those comments helped the report to get the final quality it had. But we're still not at the final stage, because this was only the first cycle of review. And on the basis of all the review comments collected in this first cycle of review, the authors prepared then a second draft, which is improved on the basis of the comments. And then this second draft, a few months later, of course, is then in its turn subjected to a second round of review. And this is a little bit different from the third cycle, because it's a review by experts, the same as in the first round if they wish, but also governments are invited, and intergovernmental organizations and non-governmental organizations are invited to comment as well. On the basis of all those comments, then the authors prepare the final draft, and this final draft will go to the plenary process together with another product which has been elaborated on the way, which is the summary for policymakers. And the summary for policymakers, which as its name implies, is meant mostly for the decision makers, is of course a much shorter document, which summarizes the key reports. And that summary for policymakers is also subject to several cycles of review. The last cycle of review being a review collection by of comments only by governments. And then in the very final step, it's another plenary meeting of the IPCC, which takes place with the main author, the key authors present in the room, but also representative from the governments who are members of the IPCC, and they discuss, it's called the approval process, they discuss line by line the summary for policymakers, so that really at the same time it reflects perfectly the reports which it summarizes, and is as policy relevant as possible, so that the product is really useful for policy making. Well, this is in a written form some of the elements I just evoked about the summary for policymakers, and it's important to understand that contrary to what is sometimes said or written about the IPCC process, the representatives of governments, who often are scientists themselves, they're not, some of them are functionaries, but most of them are scientists. They don't vote to approve or disapprove a sentence in the summary for policymakers. There is no vote in IPCC. We work by consensus on every word and detail as far as the summary for policymakers is concerned. But it's also very important to understand that the authors have to endorse the changes possibly made at the request of government. So a summary for policymakers will never contain something which the scientists authoring the report disagree with. So that's very important to understand. It is not a document produced by policymakers, certainly not by policymakers only. It's a summary for policymakers endorsed by scientists. And if some country at the end of the discussion, which is sometimes at the end of a long night, disagree still, and if there's no way to find a consensus, they still have the liberty to add a footnote in the final report to express their disagreement when the rest of the world agrees on the key conclusion at stake. So some information about the fifth assessment report, which was published in 2013-2014, the first working group of IPCC dealing with the physical science basis, the natural science basis, was published in September 2013. Then the second working group dealing with impacts, adaptation and vulnerability was published in 2014, together with the report of Working Group 3 dealing with mitigation, that is the reduction of greenhouse gases. And then a little later, in the autumn of 2014, a synthesis report summarizing the 5,000 to 6,000 pages of the above reports contained in a transversal and synthetic way the key messages presented in a useful manner for policy making of the whole report. Each of those documents in itself has a summary for policymakers. So there are a total of 4 summary for policymakers for those 4 contributions to the 5th assessment report. How does the IPCC interact with society? Well, the IPCC actually predates the UNFCCC. It was created, the IPCC was created in 1988, while the Climate Convention, the UNFCCC, was only adopted in 1992, actually inspired by some of the work made by the IPCC. The IPCC became the main scientific basis for the UNFCCC process. And also in many countries, in many companies, and in many parts of civil society, the IPCC is really the scientific reference used as a foundation for the decisions taken afterwards. The UNFCCC, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, also decides how the IPCC guidelines prepared by a part of the IPCC called the Task Force on Inventories have to be used for the national greenhouse gas inventories, which is of course important in climate policy. It's important to agree on the way to measure emissions so that they can be compared from one sector to another or from one country or activity to another. It's worth noting that the IPCC has been awarded in 2007 the Nobel Peace Prize together with Al Gore for its work dealing with climate change as a contribution to overall peace, the peace process. The IPCC, we should recognize that, was also attacked over time, including by some unjustified accusations of some of its authors. In 2009, just 10 years ago, they were accused of manipulating temperature data. There have been external inquiries done outside of IPCC by science academies and very respected bodies which proved that these accusations were totally baseless. The IPCC sometimes make a mistake. It made a mistake, a small one, on page 432 or something of one of its volume. And this was heavily discussed in 2010. This was an error about the date of melting, the speed of melting of Himalaya glaciers. It was indeed something wrong in the IPCC, and in a sense, this shows the importance of having as many reviewers and good review comments to filter out that kind of mistake. It's very hard not to make a mistake in a 5,000-page document, but it can happen. But if there are many reviewers, it can help to decrease the probability of that. And also, this crisis in 2010 has led to the improvement of the IPCC processes, and now the IPCC has more precise rules on how to use literature sources, enhance the role of review editors who are helping the authors to deal with the review comments, and also the IPCC has now better procedures to correct errors when an error is detected. If you stand back a little bit and look at the IPCC process on the left column and the international climate process in the right column, you see that each IPCC report predated a very important step in the policy process. The first assessment preceded the adoption of the Climate Convention, as I mentioned. The second assessment report in '95 helped to finalize the text of the Kyoto Protocol and to provide a framework for the negotiations about the Kyoto Protocol adopted in '97. The third assessment report helped to finalize the ratification by all countries, or almost all countries of the world, of the Kyoto Protocol, which only took place in 2005. Then the fourth assessment report, published in 2007, was provided the foundation for the Copenhagen Accord in 2009, 10 years ago, which very importantly, you know, sometimes Copenhagen Accord is described as a failure. Well, of course, it was not a full success, but a key result of the Copenhagen Accord was an agreement to say that the limit not to overpass in terms of temperature, global temperature increase was 2 degrees above the pre-industrial, and even the 1.5 degrees C limit was mentioned as something to look further into, which actually happened in Paris in 2015. As you know, the temperature target then was updated to well below 2 degrees C, while pursuing effort to try not to avoid, not to pass above 1.5 degrees C. And this was very much based on the report made in the 5th assessment report, the last part of it published in 2014. So the Paris Agreement is clearly would not have been adopted without the foundation work made over the 20 years before by the IPCC. But there are a number of other reports that are important as well. And if we look at the reports that were produced after the Paris conference, it was a special report invited also by COP21 to a special report on the consequences of a global warming of 1.5 degrees C compared to a warming with 2 degrees C or a higher value, but also what needed to be done at international level globally to stay under a warming level of 1.5 degrees C. This led to the famous carbon neutrality by 2050 idea, which is very much on the table now. Then this spring, the IPCC refined its guidelines for inventories. This August, the IPCC finalized its special report on climate and land with very important conclusions on agriculture, desertification, forestry, and consequences of climate change for all those sectors. And then a few weeks ago, another special report, the IPCC was very active in 2019 and before, a new special report was just published in September on the cryosphere, that's everything that's frozen on the planet, and the health and the state of the oceans in relationship with climate change, looking at the interactions between oceans and the cryosphere in both directions in the context of a changing climate. And then right now, the IPCC is heavily working and preparing itself for the AR6, the 6th assessment report, the first volume of which will be published in April 21 on the natural science basis. I mean, it's not only the physical science basis, there's some chemistry and biology as well, but it's called the physical science basis. Then the volume 3 will be published after volume 1. That is the volume on mitigation of climate change. And shortly after the summer of 2021, the report on climate change impacts, adaptation and vulnerability will be published. Then the synthesis report in the spring of 22. And this will be on the table of the international climate negotiations when they discuss the global stock take in 2023 to help prepare a possible update of the national contributions in the framework of the Paris Agreement. These are the special report the cover of the special reports I just mentioned. They are all available on the IPCC website if you are interested. And now what we are talking about right now is how you can help the review of the first draft of the Working Group 2 report, which is the part of the AR6 dealing with impacts, adaptation and vulnerability. If you want to know more about this report, You can visit the IPCC website again. A few highlights. It deals with risks, adaptation, and sustainability for systems impacted by climate change. And there will be sectoral chapter on water, food, ecosystems, oceans, coasts, cities, health, poverty. But it will also contain information presented in another way, region by region. Africa, Asia, Australasia, Central and South America, Europe, North America, small islands. There'll be cross-chapter boxes and papers on biodiversity, cities and settlements by the sea, deserts, mountains, polar regions, tropical forests, sustainable development pathways. You know, we are now in the context internationally of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, and this is really a very important concern for those who gave the mandate to write this report. I mean, the government of the world, and the relationship between climate efforts and the SDGs will be very much handled in this report as well. The review period for the IPCC report are on this slide. What matters right now is the review of the FOD, that's jargon for first order draft. SOD means second order draft. We are now at the first order draft of Working Group 2, and from October 18, that's very soon, to until mid-December, 13 December, there's a review period for Working Group 2, and that's where you can help and intervene as reviewers and contribute on the basis of your expertise to make this report the best ever. And I think I spoken too long, because I think some of what I just said was meant to be said by Leo. So I should stop here and hand over to Leo. My apologies. In my enthusiasm, I couldn't stop.
Okay, you may go ahead, Leo.
Okay, thank you, Jean-Pascal, for being so enthusiastic. No problem. But we're almost there. Actually, we're ahead of time, so there's more time for questions and answers. So feel free to, whatever your questions are, to submit them through the Q&A box on the bottom of your screen. This review period is just to let you know that although we are now focusing on this review of the first version of the Working Group 2 report on impact, adaptation, and vulnerability, there are many more coming. And next year, so if you're really enthusiastic about becoming an expert reviewer, there are more possibilities. The second version of the Working Group 2 report will be reviewed next year from August to October. And then we have Working Group 3 that deals with mitigation. So it's how to reduce emissions of greenhouse gases. They will have their first order draft ready in next winter and can be reviewed from January to March. And they will have their second version will be available in July, September. This will all be available also on the website, not really necessary to take notes. Just one thing maybe to add to what Jean-Pascal already said, the Working Group 2 reports contains specific huge chapters on regional issues. So there's a chapter for Africa, a chapter for Latin America and the Caribbean, North America, Asia, Europe, and Oceania. Those may be of particular interest to you to see if the information that you can find in there is really the important one. You may be aware about sources that authors have missed. So I would particularly recommend, if we get to that, to take note of these regional chapters. Coming to the end of this presentation, We have to acknowledge, of course, that this whole short course is funded by the National Science for the Environment, NERC, UK8, so that is from the British Government of Foreign Affairs, and is also supported by the Dutch Government of Foreign Affairs and IDRC in Canada. We're almost there. We still have, I think, ample time for questions and answers. You can submit them in English or French or Spanish, and we have Jean-Pascal for French and Maria Jose for Spanish. If questions pop up later in your head, feel free to send them to the email address you see there, info@futureclimateafrica.org. We will take care of it. All the stuff will be put on the FCFA website, recordings to presentations, and also responses to questions that we could not handle here verbally in the time left or that may come up later. And of course, you're cordially invited to, if you haven't done so yet, to register for the next webinar where we go into more depth and actually all about the tips and tricks and do's and don'ts to conduct an effective IPCC review, also on a Tuesday at the same time. If you want, you can already register as an expert reviewer. You can see the URL at the bottom of the screen that will be up for some time, so you can jot it down, and it will also be, of course, available on the website. And actually, the participants will also receive some mailers after this and a poll. And I think Karen Morris is the right person to explain all about that. Karen, is it okay to explain what the next steps are?
Hi.
Yeah.
Hi. So following the webinar, we will access the video and try to clean it up. And then we will try to make it publicly available on the FCFA website together with the presentations and the list of Q&As as well. So any Q&As that we are unable to address at this stage, they will be addressed after the webinar in an Excel document, which will also be made available on the website. So as soon as these are all online, a communication will go out to all the registrants for the webinar, informing them that it's now publicly available.
So, Karen, I think now we could start with the question and answer part. Is that okay?
That's totally fine. So I'll start up with the first question. So the first question we received was, IPCC doesn't pay for research, but what can researchers do to get financing for their activities?
Okay, well, that is quite a general question. Maybe let me give it a shot at this first, and then Jean-Pascal, could you add whatever you think is important? Indeed, IPCC doesn't pay the people that do the assessment. Researchers that are involved as an author to the IPCC or as a reviewer, they do that as a voluntary job. And that is, of course, specific thing. So, but it gives you something back as well, especially an author, but also for expert reviewers. By submitting comments, you will become connected to the international community of climate scientists. And important, also expert reviewers, if they have submitted comments, whether it would be 1 comment or 500, it doesn't matter, they will be acknowledged in the report upon publication, so that will enhance your visibility. I think the most important part of it is that you can help the IPCC to make better reports about regional issues, which are important for the climate policies in your own region, your country, or your or city. So I hope that helps the question to address the question somewhat. Jean-Pascal, would you need to add? Do you want to add something?
I'm ready to. Yes, I'm ready to add. Do you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes. Yes, thank you. I fully agree with what you just said. I would add that when you if you submit good review comments, it's a way to get in touch indirectly, or to be visible, to be made visible to the authors of the relevant chapter, and this may help to get in touch with them later about the content of the chapter, and maybe sometimes there are opportunities for collaboration. Another possibility is for at least young scientists who don't have a PhD, is through the scholarship, the IPCC scholarship program, which was created after the IPCC received the Nobel Peace Prize, and the Nobel Peace Prize money was actually used to help fund that program together with some foundations. So there are some possibilities there as well. Check the IPCC website and look for IPCC scholarship program. But otherwise, it's really clearly out of the mandate of the IPCC itself. So unfortunately, the IPCC is not taking and will not take a leading role to directly fund research, but it recognizes the needs for additional funding, particularly in developing, and even more particularly in least developed countries, and that can only help, I hope, to develop that funding in the future, but it will not come through the IPCC, unfortunately.
Okay, thank you for addressing that question. The next one that came through says the reports are produced in English, which is logical. The translations are available in other major languages only several months later, which sounds incredible. How can individuals contribute to speeding up the process?
That's a question for Jean-Pascal.
Yeah, well, I really wish I was in a position to influence that process. I'm not in the leadership of the IPCC anymore, so I can't, but I'm very frustrated as a French-speaking person that the translations, at least in the 6 UN languages, I mean the 5 other languages than English, namely Spanish, French, Arabic, Chinese, and Russian, are not made available, particularly for the summary for policymakers, much faster. I mean, I just learned a few days ago that the translation of the special report on 1.5 degrees C had finally been made available, which is a shame because it's 1 year after the report was finalized. And I agree with you, it's way too long. But I can only hope that enough people will complain about this, complain publicly about this, and that enough pressure on the IPCC leadership will be exerted so they understand the importance of providing those translations quicker.
Okay, great. Thank you for that. There's another one, I think this might be for Leo, but it says, how many experts are from Africa and do they take the same stance as countries with the African Union position on the IPCC?
Okay, I don't know exactly the number of experts that are involved in the IPCC from Africa. We can find it out how many authors there are from Africa on the report that is up for the table for review. We can put that in the written version because I don't know it by heart. What I can tell you is that the number of expert reviewers from the African continent was actually quite low during the 5th assessment report that was ready in 2014. It was about, well, I think less than 1%, and it has considerably increased also thanks to the course that we gave last year. It is important to know that expert reviewers are seen as individual experts. They are not seen as representatives of a certain country or the African Union or any position of any government in the IPCC. So they're fully free to express their views or their comments or their criticism on text, whatever they want. I hope this will answer the question. Jean-Pascal, would you like to add something?
I think you answered very well, Leo. So I think it's better to leave space for other questions.
Okay.
Okay, thank you. This one's directed to Leo, and it says, how do you ensure a balanced authorship in the event there are two conflicting perspectives concerning a given issue? It is mentioned that the review team is meant to filter out, which is based on consensus.
Well, there are different ways that chapters handle conflicts, which are, of course, there are different views on a certain issue. As good academics, people disagree with everything until they are convinced by very good and sensible arguments, and then sometimes they can come to an agreement on a text. But if that's not possible, there are different ways, which happens, and there are different ways to handle that. And we'll go into more detail actually on that in the next webinar next week. But to give you an idea, IPCC has developed a specific language for dealing with different views. It's called uncertainty language. For instance, if there is a conclusion on something or a statement on something, but some people have another view on that, then they can say, well, we cannot say this and that with high confidence. We can say something with low confidence. But if everybody agrees, people can say, well, this is really high confidence. There's high agreement in literature. There's high agreement in many, many different sources. There's high agreement in the author team. So that's the way to deal with that. If that is not possible, it's also possible to simply write down the different views that were there and, if possible, have some common denominator. But it's a very good question, because a lot of people think that IPCC is a consensus machine, which is not. Jean-Pascal, please add to my words.
Well, I fully agree with what you just said. I mean, each chapter is written typically by at least half a dozen of authors, and sometimes 10 or 12 authors, with a diversity of point of view, and they learn to work as a team wherever they come from, whether it's disciplines or region, and they learn to handle their disagreement in scientific and polite way. And they're also helped by the review comments, because if they had overlooked some aspect or some argument that some reviewers bring to the fore, well, those reviewer comments will actually help the authors to converge on something that's clearer than what they had on the table before the reviewer comments arrived. So yeah, that's another reason why the review comments are so important.
Very good.
Okay, thank you. Then there's a question that came through from an early career researcher who aspires to be a contributor. If you can elaborate more on the criteria for selecting authors, and also what is the basic requirement to become an expert reviewer?
Okay, shall I start and then?
Yeah,
yeah?
Fine.
Okay. Well, first of all, as an author, if you want to be an author, you need to be nominated and selected. And for the 6th assessment report, it has already done, at least for the coordinating lead authors and the lead authors. It's still possible to become a contributing author if you think I have very specific expertise on a certain subject. Then you and you see that an author is maybe missing some important stuff. You could try to connect to that author and see if that person is willing to accept you as a contributing author. Actually, there is a document describing these kinds of things more in detail that's available on the website. And we will send you the link. That is how to participate in the IPCC in the broadest sense. We'll send you the link in a mailer that will be sent later today or tomorrow after this webinar. Then what are the basic requirements to become an expert reviewer? Well, basically, you must be sure yourself that you have some expertise on a certain subject which is in the relevant report. Uh, you don't need to be a professor with 500 publications that won a Nobel Prize. You even you don't need to submit a long list of publications or a CV. What you do have to do is, once you register as an expert reviewer, is to declare that you have specific knowledge on, well, it could be, say, impact on climate change, on forests, or on oceans, or cities, or, well, whatever is your specialty. And then normally you're simply accepted as an expert reviewer. So the threshold for being one is deliberately quite low, because it's also important that lay people with some expertise understand what's in the report. So if it's full of jargon and secret languages of just a few experts, then it is not that policy relevant. So it is also important for people who have some knowledge but are not the world best specialists to join the expert review. So, Jean-Pascal?
Yeah, I'd like to add on the contributing, on how to become contributing author. Actually, one way to become one is to contribute excellent review comments showing how relevant your the reference you are suggesting, the ideas you are putting forward are for the report. And then what happened relatively frequently is that some of those reviewers, quality reviewers, are selected to become contributing author by the author teams. That's one way to become a contributing author.
Next question.
Okay, thank you. This next one's for Jean-Pascal. And says, could you please explain in simple words, IPCC is policy relevant, not policy prescriptive?
Okay, I'll try again, since I was not clear the first time, maybe. So policy relevance means that the documents that the IPCC produces needs to be useful for policymakers. That's what the policy relevance means. So it doesn't need to talk about, you know, theoretical things that are not understandable by policymakers and that don't deal with what the policymakers are dealing with. So that's what policy relevance means. It means useful for policy making, and policy making at all levels. And then not prescriptive means that the statements in an IPCC document, when they relate to elements of solutions, whether in the adaptation area or the mitigation area, needs to be as objective as possible, based on the literature, based on facts, and need to relate those elements of solutions to qualities or disadvantages as assessed by the literature. For example, the costs of a particular technology, or the disadvantage of a particular technology in terms of, I don't know, greenhouse gas emissions or other waste products or social consequences, whatever, as shown by the literature. You know, showing for each element of solutions the pluses and the minuses, and then putting that on the table of policymakers in a clear way with references, so they can make the choices they need to make on the basis of their value judgment and on the basis also of all the other constraints they have to address.
May I add a simple example? Policy prescriptive would be governments have to implement greenhouse gas reduction policies and increase it dramatically in the next 30 years. That's policy prescriptive. And what will be policy relevant and not prescriptive, if governments would like to meet the targets of the Paris Agreement, keeping global warming well below 2 degrees, In that case, they will have to reduce greenhouse gas emissions to net zero in the next half of this century. But then it's conditional, if then.
Exactly.
Hopefully that clarifies it.
Yeah. If I can also complement what Leo said, what is often said, and it is wrong, is that the IPCC said that the world couldn't allow temperature to go above +2 degrees above the pre-industrial, and that the international community had to have this target, 2 degrees or 1.5 or whatever. And this is not true. This would have been policy prescriptive. But what the IPCC said, and look at the special report on 1.5 degrees, is that if you look at risks from climate change, the risks are significantly higher, and this is documented with many details, for a 2-degree warming, for example, than for a 1.5 degree warming. And then it's for policymakers to decide what they want. Do they want to do what's needed to stay below 1.5 degree warming or not? But it's their choice. It's not the choice of the IPCC. The IPCC only explained what the consequences of different choices would be, but not more.
Okay, next question.
Okay, let me just, there are quite a few questions coming through. So let me just, okay, here's one that says, considering that LDCs will be the most affected communities, please can both presenters highlight the importance for climate experts from developing countries to include their review comments?
Is this on? I tried to find the written comment in the question and answer box. Could you help me out, Karen, where to find it?
If you scroll down on the Q&A, it's the one that was submitted at 3:19 p.m.
I cannot see the questions, but I heard the question.
Okay,
and
go ahead.
It's very clear that the comments coming from reviewers in developing countries and least developed countries are very important, precisely for what we were discussing a minute ago, policy relevance. Because obviously, a reviewer from a least developed country will know much better, maybe sometimes because that's often because that person has lived in his or her body some of the consequences of climate change, or has been exposed to local literature, maybe in a non-English language that may not be known by the authors of a report. For all those reasons, it's very important indeed that reviewers from least developed countries and from developing countries in general participate in the review. Otherwise, those those personal experience, that local knowledge, sometimes even related to indigenous knowledge, which with some caution increasingly will be taken into consideration in the IPCC process, will simply be left out of the IPCC assessment process. So that's why it's so important that so many of you register and participate to the review process.
Karen, since we have, I think, only 5 minutes left, I would like to ask you if you could highlight one French and one Spanish question as well, to give them also some attention while we still have time.
Okay. In the Q&A, I think there's a French question from Zowinder Henry. Jean-Pascal, I'm not sure if you are able to see that.
No, because when I click on Q&A, I don't, the window with the question doesn't open on my screen. So sorry, I cannot see that. Surprisingly, I can see the conversation. So if you could copy that to the conversation, I might be able to see it, but for some reason, I'm unable to open the Q&A. Or should I close the conversation and
Okay.
maybe only one window can be open?
Okay, so my colleague Siobhan has actually posted the question in the chat group.
Yeah, I see.
And yes.
Yeah, well, yeah, I see that. So the question is, quelles sont les sources de financement du GIEC? What are the sources of funding for IPCC? So the English speaking know what I'm talking about. Should I answer in French or in English?
I think French.
OK. So le GIEC est financé principalement par les gouvernements du monde entier sur une base volontaire. Donc, ce n'est pas le meilleur système du monde, mais ça a marché jusqu'à présent. Donc, il y a un certain nombre de gouvernements, un nombre croissant de gouvernements, ce qui est une bonne nouvelle, qui participent au financement du GIEC. Il faut dire que le GIEC ne coûte pas très cher, hein. Ce n'est pas une organisation qui a un budget très important, hein. Il y a finalement un petit secrétariat central à Genève avec une dizaine de personnes, dont une partie du budget est offerte par l'Organisation météorologique mondiale et une autre partie par le Programme des Nations Unies pour l'environnement. Il y a une partie du personnel qui est payé par les Nations Unies elles-mêmes. Et sinon, tout ce qui concerne les voyages des participants des pays en développement, par exemple, est payé par ce qu'on appelle un trust fund, qui est alimenté par des contributions volontaires des différents pays. Donc ça, ce sont les sources principales de financement du GIEC.
Merci beaucoup. Thank you very much, Jean-Pascal. And could we select a Spanish question and have Maria José to help with the translation?
Hello, everyone. Good morning. We have a question from Alexandra Mendoza. She wants to know, how do you believe that the IPCC reports could be more widely disseminated in the university community in developing countries?
Well,
do you want to start? Or?
No, please, could you start, Jean-Pascal?
Yeah, I'll start, okay. Well, the IPCC itself has made large efforts over the last few years to organize regional workshops and national workshops in cooperation with the countries, members of IPCC, to help popularize and share the IPCC information. And those workshops have taken place in dozens of countries and regions of the world up to now, but I'm sure that more can be done. Then, you know, all the IPCC material is freely available on the IPCC website. Some, unfortunately, not fast enough. We mentioned that earlier. Some of the summary for policymakers are translated in the UN languages, including Spanish. That's very important in your case. And everybody is free to try to find the authors from one's own country, for example. So I don't know in which country you are living, but you could try to connect with the authors from your country from either a recent report or a forthcoming report, and see with those persons, if there are more than one, how they can serve as relay person of the IPCC to participate in an event to share the information.
Okay, I think, Karen, I think we still have 1 minute.
Okay.
Up to you.
Yes, 1 minute. So if you have 1 minute, then maybe we could go to the poll. Or unless you want to answer one more question.
Well, I have time, but it shouldn't take too long. Maybe one more question, and then please explain all about the poll and next steps.
Okay, so Maria is there. I see there's some other questions in the chat box. Do you perhaps want to put one of those forward?
In Spanish, I cannot find another one. Let me know the name. of the person here.
Okay.
In that case, I suggest we go on with the poll because we may lose a lot of people that reserve time until now. So I think we will answer the other questions in written form. And over to you, Karen, about the poll and next steps.
Okay, thank you, Leo. We'd like to thank everybody for joining us today on the webinar. As we explained earlier on, the recording and the presentations, copies of the presentations and the other Q&As will be made available on the FCFA website. We will be notifying everybody once these are available online. Thank you to the presenters and to Maria Jose for translating. What we'd like to do now is launch a poll, a 2-minute poll, and we ask everybody to please participate. And yeah, it'll take 2 minutes, and if everybody can please take part in that, we'll keep it up for about 2 minutes. Thank you to all who have participated. Thank you once again for joining us. And this is also a reminder that the next webinar will take place on the 22nd of October. If you have not yet registered, we encourage you to please do so. And the registration links can be found on the Future Climate for Africa website. We also ask that if you know of anybody who would have liked to have attended but was unable to, please share the resources and share them with your networks widely. Thank you very much, everybody, and enjoy the rest of your day.